Hello, everybody. We're so happy to have you here today. Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live Q&A topic, we'll be discussing the clinical evaluation, measurable objectives and acceptance criteria to verify device safety and performance. Our speaker today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And now I'll turn it over to you, Lori.
Hi, everyone. This is Lori Mitchell. Thank you for joining in this recap or overflow session from a very popular Ask the Expert session that we had, I believe, last week. There were so many questions that we wanted to reconvene again on to try to get to a few more questions. So thanks for joining. So again, this is, if you have questions on identifying meaningful safety and performance endpoints, otherwise known as measures, S&P, I usually call them S&P objectives, endpoints, measures. We'd love to see your questions about that. We've already got some questions coming in. We're going to talk about demonstrating that safety and performance objectives are appropriate. There were lots of questions about appropriateness and clinically relevant, and specifying acceptance criteria that are used to determine the acceptability of the benefit risk profile of the subject device. So without further ado, let's get started with our questions.
Okay, let me know when you can see our first question on your screen.
I can.
Okay, does the acceptance criteria need to be defined in the PMCF plan? What about the justification for the chosen acceptance criteria?
So the acceptance criteria are rates. They're data, they are rates, they are generally defined. Their source of information is defined out of the state-of-the-art section of the CER. That's where they're born, if you will. They are utilized, could be utilized and republished, if you will, into the PMCF plan that would be appropriate. And that could be your choice. I don't know if the notified body has strict rules or an opinion about that. I would tend to put acceptance criteria into a PMCF plan because they've already been established in the CER out of the state-of-the-art section. And the competitor device state-of-the-art, or competitor device search. What about the justification for the chosen acceptance criteria? Again, we can talk more about this in other questions, but the acceptance criteria are rates that are pulled from competitor device results. So really, you're not justifying acceptance criteria. You would need to justify your safety and performance objectives. The acceptance criteria proceed from the safety and performance objectives that you've established and are derived from competitor device data. So that is a short recap of that question, and let's hear the next one. I hope that helped.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you expand on the term acceptable when referring to acceptance criteria rates?
So acceptability, there are a lot of questions about acceptability, and it's a bit of finessing. So I want to kind of talk about it a little bit more. Acceptability has to do with the risk profile this is getting back to your risk and benefit profile, and is there acceptability that the objectives are in line with your risk benefit profile, is the short answer for that. And standard care in literature, clinical investigations, they're pulled from PMS data. So when you're looking about acceptability of your safety and performance objectives, and I just noticed this question again, can you expand on the term acceptable when referring to acceptance criteria rates? So the word acceptability doesn't really apply, in our opinion, to the acceptance criteria rates. Acceptance criteria are data that are pulled from your competitor device as it relates to the safety and performance objectives. So first of all, are your safety and performance objectives acceptable? Do they relate back to the your clinical device's clinical benefits? Acceptance criteria are data, and those data establish the bar by which your subject device's data are then compared against. Then you have to get into, at the end of your CER or PER, you are now going to have to justify how your subject device's data compared to the competitor device acceptance criteria. And if your data fell short in some areas, you would need to justify why that isn't a clinical problem for your patient. So that's where the justification comes in. It's in the analysis of your subject device's data against the acceptance criteria rates that are pulled from your competitor device published data. So there is no acceptance when it comes to data. The data from your competitor devices, they are what they are. And those rates or those bars or levels in which your device's data must be compared against, that's where you're talking about acceptability and justification if your device's data falls a little short of the acceptance criteria. I hope that helped. That was a long answer.
Great, thank you. Let's get to our next question. How do I find comparison rates to use in the state-of-the-art section?
So again, comparison rates, if we're talking, I'm not sure what that question means. How do I find comparison rates? If we're talking about the acceptance criteria for because in your state-of-the-art section, let me back up. In your state-of-the-art section, you're not talking about your subject device directly. You start at the beginning of establishing the state-of-the-art landscape, moving all the way through down to maturity of technology, and it's only there in that section of the state-of-the-art discussion that you begin to describe the type of technology and the type of device in which your subject device exists in that space. But you never really talk about you never really talk at all about your subject device at all in the state of the art. It's all about the landscape. And then that becomes the competitive landscape. And then from that competitive landscape, you now establish common safety and performance objectives applicable to that competitive landscape in which your subject device exists, and acceptable as it would relate back to your risk benefit profile for that type of device. And then you're pulling, and let's say you've identified that you have 5 key major competitors for your device. You would then do your competitor device search, literature search, identify out of that search, you would identify acceptance criteria for your competitor devices. When they report the same safety and performance objectives in their published literature, death at 30 days. Let's just say that you use that one as one of your safety performance objective. Well, your competitors are probably reporting that same metric. That's the data that you pull. So that's how you find acceptance criteria rates in the state-of-the-art section. And I imagine there will be more questions about that as well.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, how do you develop safety and performance criteria for non-measurable outcomes?
Well, this is definitely a hot topic, and I would like to say in general that everything is measurable at some point, whether it like, say, for example, was there procedural success, which is a surrogate performance and safety outcome. And we'll talk more about, I'm sure, surrogate endpoints as we come along here. But, you know, taking something like, did something happen? Yes or no, that's measurable. Was there a particular performance bar that was met? Again, even yes and no is measurable. It's not pretty, and it's not, you know, that it happened. You could just say that something like acceptance criteria of procedural success, which we can talk about in a bit. Was there procedural success? Yes or no? But you have to define procedural success, and then that's wherein you come into the measurement. You have to procedural success is defined as a certain way, and as long as you can pull that data from your competitor device published literature, then you can begin to define that in your S&P objectives. So non-measurable outcomes are difficult, they're qualitative, but find a way to even make it a yes/no, which is a form of quantitative. Did something happen or did something not happen? That's quantitative. It either did or it didn't. So these are, you have to sometimes get pretty creative with the way you define your safety and performance. It always links back to your risk benefit profile, and is it relevant to that as well? Next question.
Okay, here's our next question. How do you suggest that endpoints be discussed within the state of the art? Do we need to elaborate on this?
Well, I take endpoints in this case. So endpoints to me can mean a couple of things. It can mean endpoints that are established as part of some sort of clinical investigation, and that the endpoints for the measurement of success and safety that are measured in a clinical investigation are very commonly called out in your own internal clinical investigations, in protocols that you've run on your devices and so forth. So that's an endpoint. Safety and performance outcomes or measures are essentially those endpoints. And you would, so how do you suggest that endpoints be discussed within the state of the art? Well, first, let's decide what an endpoint is. An endpoint is really your safety and performance criteria that you are establishing for your device based upon competitor data, which is the acceptance criteria for those endpoints. So when you're talking in your state of the art about that maturity of technology section in which your device exists, you're going to now start talking about introducing the endpoints of safety and performance when you're talking about that specific technology in which your device exists. And you're going to be introducing why it's important that we measure something at 30 days or some sort of safety outcome or some sort of other performance outcome. You're going to be discussing why that is important in the milieu of your competitors. Because you're not, the state of the art, you don't talk about your subject device, you talk about the technology and the competitors in which your device exists. But that's where you begin to talk about the endpoints that are going to then, right after that in the state of the art, you're going to identify those endpoints as your safety and performance objectives.
Okay, moving right along. Our next question is, what level of evaluation is required for legacy devices?
The same level of evaluation that's required for a brand new device. And I say that, I don't really say that flippantly. That the heart of that answer is that the notified bodies, in our experience, with the clients that we work with, whether it's a legacy device or it's a brand new device, getting initial MDR submission approval, the level of rigor across a CER, or for our IVD colleagues on the call for a PER, remains the same. So that's the short answer for that. It's the same level of evaluation, the same rigor.
Great, thank you. Here's our next question. Can you base your criteria on just 2 to 3 competitors if that are all the direct competitors that you have?
Yes, actually you can. And here's why. You know, the notified bodies don't want you to make things up. So for example, when you do a very robust literature search and on your subject device, I'm off topic a little bit, but this is a good example. People worry about the level of data available on the subject device, that there is none. It's a legacy device. Nobody writes about it anymore, that kind of thing. Notified bodies realize this is can be part of the landscape. So when we do a subject device search for a very old legacy product, even if it's a 10-year long search and there are no data or essentially no data on it, the notified body won't point to that and say, hey, you did that wrong, or we don't accept that. What you're showing them is, look, we did our due diligence and there's no current published clinical data on our device out in the published literature. The notified body is satisfied with that because they see you did your due diligence. It's the same answer here. Can you base your criteria on just a few competitors? If that's all the direct competitors there are, it's the same answer. Yes, you can. And that is, now, will you have sufficient data and will you be able to establish a solid acceptance criteria out of just those 2 or 3 competitors? You better make sure you design your safety and performance objectives that fit not only the risk-benefit profile and underpin the risk-benefit profile of your device, but you better also make sure that those 2 or 3 competitors are publishing out in the clinical literature data on those same safety and performance objectives. Because if you create safety and performance objectives for your device that are, I don't know, esoteric or very specific or not really widely accepted, and you only have a couple of competitors and you go into their data to establish your acceptance criteria and they haven't published anything, any data about your S&P objectives that you've chosen, then you've got nothing. So make sure that your S&P objectives on your device align with how your competitors are publishing endpoint data with their clinical trials or other things that they've done out in published data.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. How do you report safety and performance on devices which are not directly studied or specific to a disease or condition?
So this loops back to the surrogate. This is touching really on the surrogate endpoints question of safety and performance. And for those of you that have been on other calls with me, you may have heard me use this example before. It's a good one. It's a clear one, but it may not apply to you. But let's just talk about any device, whether it's an orthopedic screw, whether it's a guide wire, whether it's some sort of accessory that's used in a larger procedure or along with another device in which there's plenty of published data on, but your lowly screw or your lowly trocar or your lowly guide wire has no data out there, nobody talks about it, then you have to get creative, and you have to start creating surrogate or indirect endpoints for safety and performance. And what are those? Those are objectives that are in line with current clinical practice related to your lowly guide wire or trocar or screw. So they align with current clinical practice of how that device is used. In other words, it's used in certain types of procedures, for example. And that's a part of the current clinical practice. And then also the other thing you need to think about is that the objectives are considered acceptable given the corresponding severity levels per your own internal risk management documentation. So go back to your risk management documentation. What are you defining out there for acceptability rates? And that will help loop together your safety and performance objectives as surrogates. So if you in your risk management documentation, you can't really, how do you track acceptability of safety and performance in risk management of your guide wire? Start within your own company and look to see how you're doing that, and make sure those align with clinical practice is one way to do that.
Great, thank you. And I want to pause for just a moment to mention to all our attendees that last week we held an hour-long webinar on this topic. So if you missed it, or if you'd like to watch it again, we'll go ahead and share the link in the chat for you. And here's our next question. Can we utilize published meta-analyses, or do we need to create our own meta-analysis from published literature on competitor devices?
So this is a question, again, that gets to, we're back to competitor devices again, and what do we use competitor device data for? We use it to pull acceptance criteria rates for the safety and performance objectives that we've established for our subject device. So this is, so these are data. Now, meta-analysis data is a solid and a good source of acceptance criteria rate. It's a high level of evidence. It's weighted, and it's usually a very robust type of meta-analysis. So if you can find meta-analysis data on your safety and performance objectives in competitor published literature, or in published guidelines or professional guidelines, that's another source, and that's where you often see meta-analysis data. Now, there's a small hiccup here, which in our experience has been acceptable. What if your subject device data are used as a part of that meta-analysis? That's a question that we've been asked. Because if the meta-analysis in number is so large and robust that your device data doesn't make a material difference in the rates, then that we have used that before, and that's been considered acceptable. Meta-analyses do not necessarily, and this would be an internal decision on your part, but meta-analyses don't necessarily need to exclude your own subject device's data. But that's a conversation. So no, you do not need to create your own meta-analysis. You can use meta-analyses that found in published literature and guidelines relevant to your device.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. Can you please highlight the differences between the PMCF evaluation report and the clinical evaluation report?
The post-market clinical evaluation report would be a feeder document, if you will, into your CER. There's no other document basically more important than the clinical evaluation report. It is the It is the document that houses all incoming information relevant to the evaluation of the safety and performance of your subject device when used as intended. A PMCF report is a input into the CER. So a PMCF report would be basically a data-driven report in which there is where you're presenting and analyzing the data derived from some sort of a PMCF study or user survey or something, whatever the source of the PMCF data are. You would then analyze those given your safety and even incorporate your safety and performance objectives into that report. But ultimately, that report can exist internally in your own quality management system and can inform other decisions with regards to your PMCF activities. But that would be data, the data housed in it would ultimately flow into your CER.
All right, thanks for that clarification. Here's our next question. How valid is it to justify safety and measurable objectives when bench testing is only where clinical evidence is limited?
It's a bit tricky. And you, first of all, remember it's a bit tricky. You would have to be artful in the way you would word this. And again, this is great because a person is asking and acknowledging that first and foremost, you need to justify the choice of your safety and performance objectives that you're going to use ultimately to evaluate the safety and performance of your own device. So look within. First of all, look at your benchtop testing. Look at the clinical investigations and for endpoints that you've done. So all of that, all of those sources of internal information, risk management, clinical investigation data, anything manufacturer held, which is manufacturer held data and information is PMS data, it's benchtop and non-clinical data, and it's your own clinical investigation data. And so you can look to those sources of information to establish and justify your safety and performance. But benchtop data is very technical, and remember that safety and performance objectives are clinical objectives. So don't lean too heavily on your benchtop analysis data, because that's by definition not clinical. Clinical means in people. And that's going to be your rate limiting justification. You can only go so far.
All right. Here's our next question. How do you assess performance criteria when the device is not on the market?
Well, if the device is not on the market, that automatically means that there are no published data on your device other than something that you have published, or in other words, manufacturer held data. So let's start with that. When a device is not on the market, that means that you don't have PMS data, and that means that your only source of data is manufacturer held, what you have created on that device. So in the process of your clinical development plan for your development of your new device, which is not yet on the market, look to your clinical development plan. What did you establish in that when you wanted to define how safe and effective is your device? What did you want to prove in your clinical trials? What did you want to justify? You'd have to look there first. You have to look within your own documentation.
Here's our next question, Lori. Does the acceptance criteria need to be defined in the PMCF plan? What about the justification for the chosen acceptance criteria?
Well, let's take both of those questions. Does the acceptance criteria need to be defined in the PMCF plan. I think that is, in our experience, we have done it both ways. This is for MDR now, and this would be the same for our IVD colleagues out there. If you have identified, the PMCF plan is usually being written, it's either has already been written or it's about to be written at the same time as you're writing your CEP, CER, and or updating your PMS plan to MDR. Let's say that's for example. So if you have, it's likely that you have not yet identified your acceptance criteria, which remember are data. Acceptance criteria are data. Those are pulled out of the state-of-the-art analysis and landscape analysis that you perform in your CER. So while it would be very important to have in your PMCF plan your chosen safety and performance objectives, it's more likely than not that you would not have the acceptance criteria, those competitor data rates that you have pulled for your CER, they would not be available to go into your PMCF plan. So I would say the answer to that generally is no, they're not. The acceptance criteria would not need to be in a plan. What about the justification for the chosen acceptance criteria? So that question, so remember, acceptance criteria aren't chosen, they're data. So if this really means, what about the justification for the chosen safety and performance objectives? Most definitely that would need to be put forward in your PMCF plan and should very much align with what you're going to say in your CER. It needs to match. With the justifications need to match. So cross-check, have whoever's writing your CERs, make sure they have to cross-check between the other inputs and other plans, including the CEP, for how you justify that. But generally the CEP, the clinical evaluation report, is sort of the big plan that harbors all of these justifications. There's nothing wrong with stating it again in your PMCF plan, but don't overlook putting it in your CEP. That's the more important of the two documents.
Okay, thank you. Here's our next question. Have you any particular advice on the selection process when multiple options exist for the selection of outcome measures?
All right, sure. We've got some advice for that. So in other words, how do we select our safety and performance outcome measures? How do we choose? How do we choose amongst multiple choices? First of all, your choices should align with whatever you've got as in manufacturer held data internally. Remember, every data set in a CER and PER must be weighted and appraised for relevance, level of evidence, and so forth. That's a complex process. So think about weighting and appraising of clinical data, and that some clinical data is weighted more heavily, or is more valuable, if you will, than other types of clinical data. The most valuable clinical data that you have is your own. You ran those clinical investigations. That is your PMS. That's your PMS data. That's your PMCF data. So those are your own published articles on your own data. So those are usually rank as the highest level of evidence. So be sure first when you're pulling or identifying your S&P objectives to look inward to your own data sets. What were the endpoints that you established for the clinical investigations that you performed, both in safety and performance? Start there. And one last piece of advice, Olivia. One last piece of advice would be for the audience is this does not need to be exhaustive. Limit yourself to the highest levels of evidence and to just a certain number. I'm not talking one each. but what are the most important? And it's very common that there might be only 2 performance criteria, sometimes only 1, 2, no more than 3, and maybe the same for safety. This is be very specific and choose wisely, again, looping back to considerations within your risk management plans as well.
Thanks, Lori. I think that was some great advice. And I want to also mention to all our attendees, if you're looking for some more advice, you're welcome to book a free consultation with us. And that link to book your appointment will be in the chat. Here's our next question. From a practical perspective, what needs to be in place during post-market surveillance to track these objectives and acceptance?
Well, from a practical perspective, I guess I would start with the first thing, which is make sure that you've got well-defined safety and performance objectives, and that they, as we've discussed already, so that they don't track different safety and performance objectives than what you're using in your CER. You should at least be tracking relevant ones that you're using ultimately in your clinical evaluation. From a practical perspective, this now gets into how do you identify this data as it moves along. Let's see, what needs to be in place during surveillance to track those objectives and acceptance. So this is a great question because it really is talking about, from the quality management system perspective, the necessary loop, the loop that we all know about, and is what the IVDR and the MDR is all about. Is that this is the continuous feedback loop, the clinical evaluation, and what you determine and learn from the evaluation process feeds back into your quality management system, of which your risk benefit is a large part of that. And then so it's an ongoing evaluation. You know, from a practical perspective for PMS surveillance and maybe understanding the landscape better, if you have the access to a librarian services, one of the things that we do for our clients who don't have access to librarian services is we set up those searches in the platform that we use, which is ProQuest Dialogue. Our librarian sets up those ongoing searches, and then every month, it could be even more often than that, there may be new published data that arise that match your search criteria, that search criteria that you put alerts on, and our librarian can see those alerts coming in, and you can begin to get a feedback loop right there with new data coming in, which some reviewer would need to review those new articles for relevance to perhaps safety and performance, new AEs, off-label use. All kinds of things could happen. So that's one practical approach to track your objectives and acceptance criteria, looking at new data that comes by setting up alerts.
Great, thank you. We have time to just get to a few more questions. So our next one is, should we limit the safety and performance objectives or acceptance criteria to only those that we expect to find periodic data to support?
Well, that gets back to my earlier answer, right? Which is, you know, it's a yes and no. Yes, you should select your safety and performance objectives to those, and not acceptance criteria, because remember, acceptance criteria comes after you've already selected your safety and performance. So you select your safety and performance objectives to those in which you expect to find data. Absolutely, you do. Limit is the word that I'm a little worried about in that. There's a sweet spot for limiting, and we've talked about that. How many is too many objectives? Or unnecessary, I should say, and how few is too few that would not be acceptable to the notified body. You can't just choose one of each and call that, you know, enough of an analysis. So somewhere in there is a sweet spot, but certainly if you're choose a number that go back to your risk management to align with clinical practice and that you think you've got good data on.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. What's the best way to capture information regarding similar or competitor devices?
So similar / competitor, that's a good way. That's a good way to say that. You do a clinical literature search. That is from the MDR and the IVDR standpoint, that's the only way to do it. Because you do not have, you as your own manufacturer, of course, as we all know, you do not have direct access to any competitor manufacturer's internal data. We already know this. So where do you find a source of competitor data to establish your acceptance criteria? Out in the marketplace, out in the published literature. You do a very robust and methodologically sound systematic literature review of your chosen competitor devices and and that's all published in the state of the art section. We've done whole webinars just on that, doing that. But those acceptance criteria cannot be understated as to their importance. They are creating the bar by which your device will be measured and justified against its safety and performance. So the notified body must be confident that there's no bias that's been introduced into your competitor device searches, and that you have pulled data that exists on those safety and performance objectives for all of your competitors, good or bad. And then that creates rate ranges, and those rate ranges are against which your device now must be compared. Again, good or bad. They have to be very confident that you've done an outstanding job of establishing those acceptance criteria rates.
All right, we have time for just a few more questions. Can you please elaborate more on the competitor device safety and performance search for the state of the art? Are you referring to those outcomes from meta-analyses primarily, or are you referring to studies solely focused on competitor devices?
So again, we're remaining on the topic of competitor device safety and performance, the search for the acceptance criteria found amongst your competitor device landscape to establish, and you're doing that in the state of the art section. Are you referring to those outcomes from meta-analyses primary? So that would be, are you referring to, I take that to mean those rates that come from meta-analyses primarily. It can be a mix of meta-analyses and direct competitor. Company X has a direct competitor of yours, and they've published some retrospective or even prospective types of studies on your device, and on their device, of which that's a competitor, and you can pull those solely focused on the competitor devices. It can be a mix, is what I'm trying to say. It can be strong meta-analyses or competitor device data very specific to a single competitor device. The most important thing to remember is how strong are the data. You have to wait and analyze those. And so they should be very robust, from very robust sources of studies.
Thanks, Lori, for that answer. Here's our last question for today. How do you approach building acceptance criteria for clinical outcomes using literature where they could be defined or reported using different methods?
Again, the most important thing to remember, that's an interesting question. I'm really, you can hear me hesitating because I'm thinking it through. When you go out to, I don't know that the methodology per se is as relevant as what exactly are they reporting on. If they're reporting on pretty much exactly the same safety and performance objective that you've chosen. And I'm going to use one. Let's just say you've chosen rate of death at 30 days, something like that. Now, if you are now looking at for some of your competitor device analyses out there or published literature, and you see a rate of death at 15 days or a rate of death at 6 months, it's not the same, and you can't, so that's an apples and oranges thing. Another thing could be define the type of death, because we do a lot of vascular studies, and there's cardiac death and there's non-cardiac death. So be careful about those kinds of nuances. So it's not so much about the methodology, it's about the definition. They may be defined differently. So be careful as you're proceeding through that you're using the same definition. Again, for those of you that are in this area, bleeding rates, for example, there's probably about 4 measures of bleeding. And make sure that you're, again, apples to apples. You're using data that are using the same definition of bleeding that you're using for your own device. That's my input there. I sure hope all of this has helped with the audience on the call. I know there's many, many more questions. Olivia, do we have time for any more, or are we done?
I think that's all the time we have for today. And I hope we were able to answer most of your questions, but if we didn't, you can go ahead and send your questions into us at consult@criterionedge.com. That's this email that you see here on our screen. We'd be happy to schedule an appointment with you and get your questions answered. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Take care and have a nice day.